12th. It has been quite an extraordinary 10 days since our last boot camp.
Hello,
Both from the
Susan.
standpoint of President Trump really flexing his muscle, as we saw in the Texas runoff between Paxton and Cornyn. That's a certain political side of the president demonstrating what the agenda must be for the midterm elections, which is his economic revolution and strategic revolution.
Nice.
Not some laundry list of conservative platitudes
Nice.
that have too often dominated the way campaigns are run.
Nice.
People who are voting for Trump's candidates, the ones where he's really coming out big time and endorsing, like Bill Paxton, like Gallrein in Kentucky and others. What people are voting for is they are voting to continue Donald Trump's revolution, especially in these congressional and Senate races, where the outcome of these races is directly tied to whether or not President Trump is going to be able to continue to legislate after the midterm elections. So that's the one side of it. The other side of it is this administration, I think, beginning to sharpen very, very powerfully the kind of messaging that we have to get across to the population in the midterms. There's the question of political power, but there's also what we've been very much focused on, of course, which is how do you message the fact that this is an economic revolution?
Right.
This is not a laundry list of policies. This is not even something you can demonstrate with great statistics, because some of the statistics are great, and we've talked about them. What we're really dealing with is nothing short of replacing one system with another system. And when you do that, everything within that system, the relationships, the definition of things, it actually begins to change.
Right.
And I think that over the course, there's been a tremendous step forward in terms of how, at least for the organizers, to understand for themselves the fact that this is a new system that this administration is pursuing. And then for us as organizers to try and feel we're going to then communicate that to people who are still stuck in that old system.
Yep.
So I want to give people a sense of what we're going to be doing in tonight's boot camp. I'm going to go through a short review of this extraordinary speech that Scott Bessent gave last Friday at the Reagan Economic Forum.
Wow.
I touched on it briefly in my Saturday update,
I love when
but
you do
I want
that.
to actually take the opportunity of this more relaxed setting to discuss it with a little bit more substantive, because I think there are really very important sections in there. And I think that if people figure out how to use those sections to be conversation starters with people, again, who are stuck in the old system and think that that's the way the world is. Either they like it or they don't like it, or they're mad at it, or they've surrendered to it. But our challenge all along is to get people out of that imperial system where people are victims and losers and consumers, and put them back to being an American, which is to be a producer who's got a certain command over the direction of their lives, as long as they work hard and work right. Scott Bessent gave us some very, very powerful tools to do that. So that's the first thing I'm going to go through. But then we're going to get a report from Texas. One of our Texas friends better be ready to go. Sort of an on-the-ground report of the implications of Ken Paxton's whomping of John Cornyn on the runoff last week. I don't know how many of you watched Scott Bessent's speech at the Reagan Economic Forum. I recommend you either watch it or you read it. The whole thing is on YouTube, and the speech itself is in the Treasury. And it really is a powerhouse. I think people are familiar with the fact that Jameson Greer gave quite a speech at Davos where he resurrected the American system by name, put the name Alexander Hamilton as the author out there. And that obviously had a tremendous effect. I'm sure it shook up the gathered would-be gods on Mount Olympus who were there at Davos. Because he basically was saying, the American system is the gift of fire, and I'm giving it back to the American people and the rest of you, and we're going to bring down your crazy imperial system. He wasn't quite as blunt as that. Howard Lutnick was pretty blunt when he said, you guys are all globalists and it's a failure, and we're here to tell you that. Jamison Greer kind of put the meat on it. But I think for a U.S. Treasury Secretary to give the kind of speech that Scott Bessent gave last week is unprecedented in my lifetime, probably unprecedented in over 100 years. And I'll leave it to our historian friend Bob Ingram maybe to figure out when the last time we had a Treasury Secretary. I don't know if you have to go all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, maybe you do, to actually put some of these basic principles forward. So I've excerpted a couple of sections from the speech, and I'm going to run through them relatively quickly. This is from the very opening of the speech. Okay. He said, "The truth is that for too long, America had been asleep." That was the title. We mistook comfort for strength. We treated efficiency as resilience and consumption as in prosperity. We told ourselves that so long as good for overseas, it didn't matter whether factories went dark in Michigan, Ohio, or Pennsylvania. We assumed supply chains would always function smoothly, adversaries would always behave responsibly, and the invisible hand would correct vulnerabilities. And then about a paragraph later, he said, "We assumed the rules-based system would discipline," and he's referencing the behaviors of the markets and our adversaries and so on. "We assumed the rules-based system would discipline these behaviors, only to find that it accommodated them." Now, there is a lot packed into those paragraphs. I'm going to get back to the consumption question when we look at another quote in a minute. Okay. But I think the two bombshells in there are his comment about how we assumed that the invisible hand would correct vulnerabilities. And we assumed the rules-based system would discipline
just like I said, England was invented with China
only to find out that it accommodated them. Now, I can't stress how important I think that is. Because he is putting the name on what Marco Rubio did when Rubio spoke in Munich about 2 months ago. I guess maybe it was February or March, where Rubio said the deindustrialization of the United States was a deliberate policy choice.
That's right.
And we're going to get back to that again. But what Bessent here is doing is labeling the nature of some of those deliberate policy choices. Now take the whole question of the rules-based system. People have been following Barbara and I on YouTube, and I suspect most of you have. We've talked about how the British are now coming out of the closet and admitting that they were the ones that set up the rules-based post-war system. That they, despite the fact that they're a small country with a small military and a terrible economy internally, that they've benefited very nicely from the rules-based system. And of course, that's because Britain happens to be the home of the City of London and the concentration of financial and other kinds of economic power that represent what people call the globalist system, but what really is an extension of the very same British imperial system that we fought the American Revolution against. And the British have also, this has been informed in Chatham House and the House of Lords report that came out a couple months ago, blatantly admitting we benefited from the rules-based order. We set up the rules-based order. We sucked the United States into the rules-based order. They didn't use that verb. But as long as the United States was part of the special relationship, the rules-based order worked nicely. As one member of the House of Lords said, the rules-based order only works if it's enforced. And the only country that can enforce it is the United States. This administration has been saying pretty clearly with the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, Lutnick's speech, Greer's speech, and others, that this rules-based order is over. Of course, from the other side, Prime Minister Mark Carney has been the poster boy for saying it's over, it's ruptured, nostalgia doesn't work. But Donald Trump broke it, and we're not going to be able to put it back together again. But here is Bessent, and again, this is very, very important, saying we thought it would help us only to find out it accommodated the behaviors which gutted our industries.
Right.
And destroyed our supply chain and destroyed our economic independence.
We did it
Again,
to ourselves.
I don't know when there's been a U.S. official who has taken the question of the invisible hand of Adam Smith and said, no, it doesn't really work.
No, we're not.
So that's one section that I wanted to highlight. The next section is more of a discussion of what the destruction actually looked like. He makes the point, there were people who warned us. They said workers warned us, military planners warned us, manufacturers warned us what free trade and outsourcing was going to do.
I warned you.
But our political class preferred the comfort of old formulas. Cheaper was always better. Offshoring was inevitable. Industrial policy was unfashionable. Well, it was worse than unfashionable. There's a whole school of thought that says industrial policy is essentially socialism. And strategic dependence was acceptable so long as the cost remained invisible. Beneath every one of those mistakes lay a more basic failure in our philosophy. In reducing economics to consumption, we forgot production. We measured abundance at the checkout counter rather than the factory gate. And those last two sentences are extremely important. Because again, without him putting the label and system on it, as Jameson Greer did, he's essentially describing one of the fundamental differences between a country which is under the British imperial system and a country which is economically sovereign. Because this whole question of reducing economics to consumption, where it's just a question of, can I buy this stuff cheap? We don't have to produce it here. We just need to be able to buy it cheap, which means you're at the mercy of whoever is controlling international currency, international trade, international investment, and so on. This whole question of the shift of the United States from a producing society, which we were in the 50s and the 60s, but it began to atrophy in the 70s, and we were gutted in the 80s and the 90s, right up to this point, where we reduced economics to consumption. And that's how the whole fraud of free trade was sold to the people who swallowed it. Obviously, not everybody did, but enough did, and especially in the political class. It all is based on your short-term, can I get it cheap today, as opposed to what is this actually doing to our economy?
Right.
And I think that bottom line just needs to be emblazoned. We measured abundance at the checkout counter rather than the factory gate. Remember, this is a Treasury Secretary we're talking about, not a Labor Secretary, not a Commerce Secretary. So then he gets, again, to another fundamental principle.
That's right.
Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of a foundational principle that previous generations understood instinctively. Well, I'd add, therein lies a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
It can't be instinctive any longer.
No.
People have to be much, much more conscious of these principles.
Yes, you have to have a plan.
One of the things our boot camps are trying to do. And he continued in terms of the foundational principle. Economic security is national security. For a nation that cannot manufacture, mine, ship, or refine its needs, gradually cedes its strength and sovereignty to others. Go back to the idea that this is a deliberate policy. This was the policy that the World Economic Forum had in mind in 1979 when they started this process by taking the dollar off the gold reserve standard, and everything NAFTA, 2008 blowout, which has happened ever since. And then he's got a couple of sections in here which really do capture at least the fundamentals, if not all of the deeper principles.
They want to enslave the entire
world. Pretty close. Of
they want
Hamilton's
everybody enslaved.
Conception of what has to be the driving metric of your society.
Europe,
he said
no
a country
money.
Cannot outsource its
Asia,
industrial
no
commons,
money.
ignore strategic concentration,
The Western Hemisphere,
and expect to remain
in danger
secure.
of losing
For
its
manufacturing
money.
is more than output on a balance
If
sheet.
it wasn't for Venezuela waking us
Very
up,
important, powerful statement. It's not about
we
the
would have
money.
been screwed.
It
Thank
is a
you,
reservoir
Venezuela,
of
for
practical
waking us up.
capability. Engineers and welders, tool and die makers, and logistics networks, plant managers and workers who know how to
Thank you
solve
for sticking up
problems
for the
on the
Western
factory
Hemisphere.
floor, which is so important. AI can be used as a tool. If a robot can lift up some huge thing and some worker doesn't have to blow out his
Break it back.
doing it, that's fine. But when it comes to problem solving, it is going to be the people intimately engaged in the production
That's right.
process,
That's
who solve the
right.
problems and
Think
come up with the
tank.
creative new ideas.
Tank.
That can never be
That think
replaced.
tank's gonna have
And
to
this
be
is a reflection of
normalized.
that.
What we
And
see
then
on
here's
television is gonna
another
have to be
important line.
normalized,
Secure
not in a
supply
movie
chains
no
matter
more.
as much as stock
We're not gonna live
indices.
that
Well,
shit.
one place where I finally disagree a little bit with Scott Bessent, it's more important than stock indices, but we'll let it stand. And then this last line here, that productive capacity is power. For all of you who have read Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers, or at least read some of our pamphlets which cover it,
Right.
and have seen the most important economic statement in there, a foundational statement, where he says the wealth of a nation is the productive powers of labor. It's the human mind able to intervene into nature to improve it, to build and invent. Bessent kind of
produce more,
channels that,
you got more
where he
on the
says,
shelf
of course,
to
America
sell.
still holds enormous advantages.
Instead of having one
Among
box
them,
of
the world's
chocolate, now you
deepest
got
capital
12.
markets, extraordinary innovators, abundant energy potential,
And it's
leading
a good
universities,
product, it's gonna
an
sell.
unmatched entrepreneurial culture,
Out the door, out
and
the door,
workers
out the
who
door,
can
out the door, out the
outbuild
door.
and outcompete anyone so long as the playing field is fair. And he then says, all we
can
needed
all
was
do
a government
that.
willing to declare
We
that
got
as
oil. The
decline
Western
is a
Hemisphere
choice.
has oil.
Again,
Venezuela
similar to what
got
Marco Rubio
machine oil.
said. Renewal can be one
Great
too.
oil
And
sell.
obviously that's what this administration is doing.
We
And
can
then the last
trade it
slide
with
I want to
Iran.
share, I
They
think
got
this is a great line where he
excellent
talks about what we need.
gasoline.
A financial system aligned with
We
national
have
purpose,
excellent
not national
machinery
purpose
oil.
being sacrificed on the altar of a financial system. Trading partnerships that reinforce rather than undermine our security relationships. And then he concludes toward the end of this speech, and it's going to be the last slide that I share with you. Indeed, the strength of this republic lies not in denying that the old consensus failed. Instead, we must restore resilience where complacency took hold, rebuild capacity where dependence took root, and above all, recover the confidence to believe a nation that knows how to build, invent, and produce, and lead is never destined for decline. Again, I think the whole speech is really quite extraordinary, but these, I think, are the highlights of it. And to me, they show that this administration is getting more laser-like in terms of what needs to be communicated as we go into this midterm election. Because as we've discussed on many of these boot camps, the organizing challenge in many cases is changing somebody's identity, changing them from feeling like they're a victim, or as Bessent says, a loser. The Democrats try and compensate the losers, or just a consumer in a system which is controlled by money, and you don't have any, and therefore you're screwed. That is what drives so many people who fall into, whether it's TDS or just apathy, or whether they have TDS or not, they think they're Democrats. I constantly stress that it is as much the question of what their identity is than it is any amount of facts that you can throw at them. So I just wanted to use the Bessent speech as a kind of pedagogical exercise in terms of taking the ideas that we've developed in these boot camps and showing how the top administration spokesman is now starting to channel that, might be able to think about how to do that. I want to leave my opening remarks there because I do want to get to the other reports so there is Evelyn. Okay, here comes Texas. Hello. Hi.